My insides were ice, and my skin was on fire. The pain of the ritual ripped through my body. My vision was blurred around the edges, and all I could see was her face. Eyes, red lips, white skin, framed by her hair so red that when the sunlight caught it, her head looked as it was wreathed in swirling flames. "Just a little bit longer," she said. I gritted my teeth and nodded. I could feel the sweat pouring down my face. "Okay, now it's my turn," she said. I picked the knife up and waited as she murmured the old words under her breath. "Eyes closed," she finished, and I shoved the knife into her heart. She groaned and lurched forward, fiery hair falling over her face, sticking to it with the sweat that had already drenched her forehead. Thin wisps of white smoke drifted up from the surface of her skin. I turned the hourglass back over and I waited, watching. Just watching that simple hourglass and the sand within it trickle, grain by grain, into the mounting pile at the bottom. We both knew it would result in our deaths. Yet, we both knew that was the only way to survive. It started with an addiction. No, that's not right. It's never an addiction at first. At first, it's only harmless fun. At least we thought it was harmless fun then. By the time we found out what it really was, it was far too late for redemption. And the only thing left was to follow along the path of destruction that had been laid before us while we willingly shut our eyes. Anna and I are vampires. We were part of a coven in New York City that consisted of 7 other members, all of them much older and much more powerful than us. At just barely over 200 years old, Anna and I were like children among gods. There was Sven and Helene, who had met sometime in the Dark Ages, and then Boris and Celeste, who had met in the early 200s. The leader of the coven was Elric. Nobody knew exactly how old he was. It was Elric who first brought us to the drug. Because he was our leader, we had no choice but to accept his gift. That is the way of the vampire society, of our immortality. For humans, no matter how powerful a ruler is in life, he eventually dies, and those under his tyranny are sometimes allowed a brief respite before they fall under the rule of another tyrant. With vampires, it's somewhat different, and the longer they live, the fewer there are who can challenge them. New ideas cannot take root because the protectors of the old never die to make way for the new generation. So when Elric brought us the drug, we didn't ask where it came from. Even a hint of questioning the leader's judgment could result in death. And besides, it seemed perfectly ordinary at first anyway, just normal human blood. It looked the same, smelled the same, and even tasted the same. Yet, as soon as the first drop ascended through the ducts in my fangs, I knew it was something very different. My heart began to pound against the cage of my chest like a rabid animal. It was not the pounding of anxiety, but the pounding of immeasurable excitement. The drumbeat of mania, wildly erratic in my chest, ears, and throat. My joints loosened and grew liquid, and the ambient pain in my body vanished into a spreading warmth that turned my muscles into slack rubber bands. I'd never felt this good before, not even when I was still human. Elric bringing us the blood, sometimes partaking with us, but usually not. When we finally didn't care at all, about anything, when the drug had complete power over us, Elric revealed the source. He led us to the poor district of town. None of us had been there for a long while. It is prime hunting grounds for young vampires who desire easy prey. But the people of this town cannot afford to eat well, and their blood is bitter, and Elric seemed positively delighted by this place. The rundown buildings with bars in the windows, the deserted streets. He stopped in an old warehouse and rust spots covering the aluminum walls like leper sores. He approached a heavy steel roll-up door and banged on it. It felt to me as if I was walking willingly into a shrapnel pit of a great beast's stomach. And as we approached, I heard sounds coming from below. Moaning, screaming, crying even. Elric opened the hatch and motioned for us to go inside while we held up the door. We did as we were bid. the room repugnant to all five senses. The humans inside were stretched on racks, tied to posts and whipped with cat's paws, strapped to chairs and shocked with cattle prods, and many other tortures old and new that I will not put down on paper. Their cries of agony mingled together in a single sound that rippled through my insides, making them squirm with revulsion. Elric had raised his voice to speak over the pitiful sound. Adrenaline and endogenous opioids, mostly. Go on and try. It's better fresh. Boris and Celeste went ahead with no hesitation. Sven and Helene shot each other with an uneasy glance, but they too stepped forward and fed. Only Anna and I remained behind, rooted to the spot by the horror of what we were seeing. Elric turned to us expectantly. Well, he said. It was Anna who spoke for us both. This is evil, Elric, she said. If you want no part of it, then I will no longer consider you a part of the Brotherhood. You are still young and idealistic. I understand that. So I will give you 3 days to think it over. Before I kill you, that is. You may go. Elric didn't wait for us to reply. He simply turned his back and went to feed. And after that moment, Anna and I turned to the other and walked out of the building. It was Anna's idea, of the two of us. She was always the clever one. We both knew that 3 days was not enough time to complete our task, but our actions were quickened by desperate knowledge that no other options lay before us. As soon as the plan was formed, we rented a car under a fake name and drove it to Ohio. We didn't fly. It would have been too easy to track us that way, and we didn't want to give Elric and the others any hint of what we were up to. We rolled into Cleveland on a sunny day. White, feathery clouds drifted lazily through the sky. It felt strange to be in such a dire situation on such a beautiful day, but I suppose it couldn't be helped. We moved into a hotel with cash and then waited for night to fall. It wasn't difficult for us to steal what we needed. The facility had been guarded, of course, but the shadows were our ally. Shadows run through the veins of vampires in place of blood, and we can melt into them if needed, dissolving through spaces through which solid beings cannot pass. Once we had obtained what we needed, we packed it carefully away and drove back to New York City. This was going to be much harder. There was no chance of us fighting it out. We had to pretend to submit. We came upon the torture warehouse near midnight. The moon was a yellow silver in the sky, like a pus-ridden wound in inky black flesh. Long shadows stretched across the building, grown darker and more sinister with the horrible knowledge of what was inside. We had the syringes underneath our coats, some taped to our wrists, ready to be loosed. Helene's eyes were wide and frantic, and black blood dribbled down his chin in 2 narrow streams. So you've come to your senses, he said. Good. Come in and partake. We followed him into the building, and down the wooden hatch that opened into the yawing mouth of mortal hell. The rest of the coven was inside, feeding, of course. Elric stood in his corner and watched. He smiled at us as we entered, but it was not a warm smile. I'm glad you've decided to return to the fold, he said. For you, I've saved the best. He gestured toward a young woman who lay bound naked. Her body was covered in scars, knife marks, burn circles, and her fingers had all been broken. We slowly approached the woman. Anna gestured for me to feed first, and I did. She fed after me. She emptied the syringe of prion-infected blood into the woman's neck. The woman hardly seemed to notice, poor thing, and the rest of the coven took notice whatsoever. They were all here feeding, or else they lay stretched out on the floor in drug-induced bliss. Eric clapped his hands. Welcome back to the Brotherhood. He bent down and drained the rest of the woman's lifeblood away. We watched his apprehension, waiting for him to realize our trick, but he didn't. He simply stretched out like a cat, letting a sigh of pleasure escape his blood-stained lips. And then we sat in the corner and we watched. Sven was the first to feel it. He was feeding when it hit him, and he suddenly staggered back from the naked man strapped to the high-backed wooden chair. He began tottering drunkenly from side to side, swatting around at the air as if he were batting away insects. Helene rushed towards him, but she stripped and fell in a way. She could not push herself up off the ground. A puddle of blood formed where her slack mouth lay in the dirt. Sven's eyes were lost and scared, and he sank to a heap on the floor as well. Boris and Celeste had been laying in the corner in drug-induced haze of pleasure. They never rose again. The only one who didn't die right away was Elric. His mouth frothed with blood and his eyes were red, and cords stood out on his neck, spilling a bubbly mix of spit and blood. We had no choice but to put the poisoned humans out of their misery, and after that we fled far away and hid ourselves. We performed the ritual that would be both our death and our salvation. Ancient words to banish undeath, and a silver dagger held inside the heart until the scourge of evil is burnt away. Only then were we rid of our vampirism, and the smell of undeath that would allow the other covens to hunt us down and destroy us for what we had done. Now we were all but invisible to them, our sins buried underneath the intermingled smell of 7 billion other humans. I know what we did was right, yet the gruesome deaths of our coven still feature often in my dreams, and I still have nightmares, waking and sleeping, about the looks of relief that washed over the faces of the tortured humans as we put them to their death. But out of everything that happened, the thing that haunts me the most is, until Anna had spoken up in protest for the both of us, I was still going to feed.